After World War II, the Commonwealth was restored pending complete independence. With independence from the U.S. came the establishment of the Third Republic of the Philippines. In April 1946, elections were held. On July 4, 1946, Philippine independence was proclaimed and Manuel Rojas became the first president of the republic. During the Rojas administration, a general amnesty was granted for those who had worked together with the Japanese, while at the same time the hawks were declared illegal. His administration ended prematurely when he died of heart attack on April 15, 1948, while at the U.S. Air Force Base in Pampanga. 2 days later, Vice President Elpidio Quirino took his oath of office as President of the Philippines. The huge task of reconstructing the war-torn country was complicated by the activities in central Luzon of the communist-dominated Hukbalahap guerrillas, who resorted to terror and violence in the efforts to attain land reform and gain political power. They were finally brought under control after a dynamic attack introduced by the Minister of National Defense, Ramon Magsaysay. Magsaysay eventually became the President of the Philippines. His campaign was massively supported by the CIA, both financially and through practical help in discrediting his political enemies. He made progress in land reform, opening new settlements outside crowded Luzon Island. His death in an airplane crash in March 1957 was a serious blow to the national morale. Vice President Carlos P. Garcia succeeded him and won a full term as president in the elections of November 1957. In foreign affairs, the Philippines preserved a firm anti-communist policy and joined the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in 1954. There were difficulties with the United States over American military installations in the islands, and, in spite of formal recognition of full Philippine sovereignty over these bases, tensions increased until some of the bases were dismantled, and the 99-year lease period was reduced. The United States rejected Philippine financial claims and projected trade revisions. Philippine opposition to Garcia on issues of government corruption and anti-Americanism led to the union of liberal and progressive parties led by Vice President Diosdado Macapagal, who succeeded Garcia as president in the 1961 elections. Macapagal's administration was marked by efforts to combat the mounting rise that had plagued the republic since its birth, by attempted alliances with neighboring countries, and by a territorial argument with Britain over North Borneo, which Macapagal claimed had been leased and not sold to the British North Borneo Company in 1878.
The war left the Philippines a terribly devastated country. It was a nightmare of chaos and corruption, of misery and destruction, of raw nerves and overwhelming desire for escape. The ravages of war had left their imprint on the economy of the Philippines. The incomes of the people dipped radically and means of livelihood were reduced tremendously. The problems that confronted the government and the men at its helm were of such nature as to challenge the statesmanship of the president, on the other hand, and the spirit of cooperation of the people, on the other. The Philippine Civil Affairs Unit, or PCAU, was organized by General Douglas MacArthur in September of 1944, a month before the landing of the American forces in Leyte, for the purpose of assisting the various military commanders in the civil administration and in the relief measures to be undertaken in the Philippine areas as they were liberated. On May 23, 1945, President Osmeña arrived in Manila after more than 3 months in the United States. With him were Senator Millard Tydings and the members of his mission. On June 2, 1945, Senator Tydings revealed the grim condition of the Philippines when he went to the United States.
So dire are the problems of the Philippines as a result of the war that the mission gave itself over completely to the acquisition of such data as would aid us in helping them to start machinery moving to get the Filipino economy going again.
The bill, known as the Belt Trade Relations Act, provided for free trade relations between the United States and the Philippines until 1945, after which goods coming from the United States and from the Philippines would be taxed 5% tariff increase every year until the full 100% was reached in 1974. Several senators opposed the rider and the parity amendments to the Constitution because it would deprive the free and independent Republic of the Philippines with one of the most effective means to control her own internal economy and stimulate her foreign trade. To make matters worse for the Filipinos, American Congress passed the Tidings Rehabilitation Act. President Sergio Osmeña of the Nacionalista Party and Senate President Manuel Rojas of the Liberal Party were the major contenders for the presidency. Senate President Rojas ran under the platform of speedy rehabilitation of the war-torn Philippines. The April 23, 1946 elections resulted in the victory of the Liberal Party. On August 5, 1946, the Congress of the Philippines ratified the Treaty of General Relations that had been entered into by and between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States on July 4, 1946. Aside from withdrawing her sovereignty from the Philippines and recognizing her independence, the treaty reserved for the United States some basis for the mutual protection of both countries, consented that the United States represent the Philippines in countries where the latter had not yet established diplomatic representation, made the Philippines assume all debts and obligations of the former government in the Philippines, and provided for the settlement of property rights of the citizens of both countries. Rojas did not finish his term that was expected to end by 1950 because he died of myocardial infarction. On the night of April 15, 1948, Rojas died at Clarkfield, Pampanga. Quirino assumed the presidency on April 17, 1948, taking his oath of office 2 days after the death of Manuel Rojas. Hukbalahap was a movement composed of Filipinos that were against the Japanese Empire because they wanted to occupy the Philippines. This movement was formed in February 1942 at Nueva Ecija, led by Luis Taruc. They wanted to be free from the abusive Japanese, so they formed their squadron consisting of more than an equivalent of half a battalion that fought the Japanese and killed hundreds of them that made the latter fear them that much.
I was chosen to organize the Hukbalahap, the biggest guerrilla army in the Philippines that fought the Japanese like Tito during the war. My intention or objectives as the commander-in-chief of the Huk movement and then as national leader of the peasants of the Philippines was to see a truly broad democratic participation of the masses to bring about land reform in our country, to bring about a truly independent nation, but maintain our close friendship with that good America I have always admired, but continue our struggle against some carpetbaggers or misguided American officials coming here whom I believe did not represent the true America I admired. So if that was my intention, land reform, good government, and a truly democratic Philippines, I'm now wondering why I suffered so much like that, including my people or my members, to be misunderstood and persecuted.
When Manuel Rojas ran for presidency, the Huk supported Elpidio Quirino, and when Rojas won, he campaigned against the Huks. But because they wanted to be sure of the country's safety, they supported the pacification campaign of Rojas. But when Taruc learned that they were being liquidated by their enemies, and Rojas was behind this, they again threw out their support to him. And when Rojas died, Elpidio Quirino took over the position, and he gave chance to the Huks by granting amnesty for them. This amnesty again did not take for so long, because this amnesty also required the Hooks to surrender their firearms, which Taruk thought was just a propaganda, so they can be easily defeated. This caused the Hooks to go back to the field and fight the government when Mrs. Aurora Quezon, the wife of the late President Manuel Quezon, was ambushed and killed, and the government accused the Hooks for this, but denied it. When Ramon Magsaysay became the president, Taruk surrendered to the government.
So my coming down was based on my own desire that peace must be enjoyed by our people. That even if I was branded surrendering, but I claim in my press interview, I surrendered only to the will of the people, not to save my neck, because I was afraid to die, but to save our people from further suffering in a internecine war that we have been involved in.
The common man, known as the tao in Tagalog, has been the object of ridicule, contempt, and pity. Yet he suffers all those with patience and amiable tolerance. Accustomed of being ignored, he was resigned to his fate and adopted an attitude of let alone in political and social matters. For 5 decades, since the American occupation, the Tao remained voiceless and not influential until Magsaysay came upon the scene. Ramon Magsaysay serves as the Secretary of National Defense under the Quirino administration, and during his term saw the pitiable condition of the Taos who lacked the leadership to make their voices heard. Magsaysay was, by nature, a man whose heart always bled for the Taos. When the proper opportunity arrived, Magsaysay, who was part of the Liberal Party, resigned his cabinet position and openly became a nationalista and was later on nominated by the party as its presidential standard-bearer. Magsaysay's presidential campaign was characterized by his emphasis on the barrio and the Taos. The result of this presidential election showed that Magsaysay was right. The fate of any election depended on the Tao, not on the sophisticated voter. Thus, Magsaysay became the 3rd president of the 3rd Republic of the Philippines. He even proclaimed and then proved himself to be a president for the people. True to his promise, Magsaysay worked hard to make the Tao a man in his community and bringing freedom and progress to the barrios. Magsaysay had the Congress pass the Agricultural Tenancy Act in 1954, which provided for greater protection to the tenants. In his desire to make the rural areas a part of the national community, he thought of extending barrio roads and constructing new ones that link rural areas to the urban centers. His famous utterance was, "He who has less in life should have more in law." Magsaysay was generous in his love for the Tao. He showed his feelings in countless ways. For the first time, ordinary Filipinos were welcome to visit the President's official residence, Malacañang Palace. Magsaysay's intentions regarding the Tao were sincere. It was his belief that by spending more time with the rural folks and by helping them to their feet, they would, in turn, learn to help themselves. But instead, the Taos came to expect that Magsaysay do all for their sake. The result was disillusionment in the part of Magsaysay. On March 17, 1957, death overtook Magsaysay in an airplane crash. Vice President Carlos Garcia automatically took office as president for the remaining 8 months of Magsaysay's term. He subsequently won the election to presidency in 1958, but his running mate, Speaker Jose Laurel Jr., was defeated by liberal rival Diosdado Macapagal. President Garcia, certainly a more sober and level-headed man, anchored his whole program of government in austerity. He favored selective controls in order to lessen or arrest the expansion of credit for non-productive activities. He expressed himself opposed to a move for return to free enterprise in the Philippines economy. He also antagonized those affected by his Filipino-first policy. Diosdado P. Macapagal was the 5th President of the Republic of the Philippines. He was instrumental in initiating and executing the Land Reform Code, which was designed to solve the centuries-old land tenancy problem, the principal cause of the communist guerrilla movement in Central Luzon. On January 21, 1961, Macapagal was chosen as Liberal Party candidate for president. 6 months after the election, however, Macapagal surprised the nationalist camp with his executive order shifting Philippine Independence Day from the traditional July 4 to June 12, the day when, in 1898, the Declaration of Independence Day was read at Kawit, Cavite. Macapagal instituted a public land clearance program to make new farmlands available for immediate use. The product of his concern for the impoverished majority was the Land Reform Code of August 8, 1963, which sought to replace the abusive and unjust tenancy system inherited from colonial times by the leasehold system, affording full government protection to the leaseholder. The positive result obtained in 1966 demonstrated the value of the land reform program in materially improving the local living conditions of the rural poor. Marcos won and was inaugurated as president on December 30, 1965. In 1969, he was re-elected the first Philippine president to serve a second term. On September 21, 1972, Marcos imposed martial law, holding that communist and subversive forces precipitated the crisis. He acted swiftly. Opposition politicians were jailed, and the armed forces became an arm of the regime. Opposed by political leaders, notably Benigno Aquino Jr., who was jailed and held in detention for almost 8 years. Marcos was also criticized by church leaders and others. In the provinces, Maoist communists or New People's Army and Muslim separatists undertook guerrilla activities intended to bring down the central government. Under martial law, the president assumed extraordinary powers, including the ability to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Marcos announced the end of martial law in January 1981, but continued to rule in an authoritarian fashion under various constitutional formats. He won election to the newly created post of president against token opposition in June 1981. Marcos tried to stabilize the financial position of the government through an intensified tax collection. He also borrowed heavily from international financing institutions to support large-scale infrastructure projects. He improved agricultural production to make the country self-sufficient in food, especially in rice. Marcos also tried to strengthen the foreign relations of the Philippines. He hosted a 7-nation summit conference on the crisis in South Vietnam in October 1966. In support for the U.S. military efforts in South Vietnam, he agreed to send Filipino troops to that war zone. The Congress of the Philippines called for a constitutional convention on June 1, 1971, to review and rewrite the 1935 Constitution. 320 delegates were elected. The convention was headed first by former President Carlos P. Garcia and later by former President Diosdado Macapagal. During these years, his regime was marred by rampant corruption and political mismanagement by his relatives and cronies, which culminated with the assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr. Critics considered Marcos as the quintessential kleptocrat, having looted billions of dollars from the Filipino treasury. Much of the lost sum has yet to be accounted for. He was also a notorious nepotist, appointing family members and close friends to high positions in his cabinet. This practice led to even more widespread mishandling of government, especially during the 1980s when Marcos was mortally ill with lupus and was in and out of office. Perhaps the most prominent example is the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, a multi-billion-dollar project that turned out to be a white elephant which allegedly provided huge kickbacks to Marcos and his businessman friend Hermino Dicini, who spearheaded the project. The reactor, which turned out to be based on old, costly designs and built on an earthquake fault, has still to produce a single watt of electricity. The Philippine government today is still paying interests on more than 28 billion US dollars public debts incurred during his administration. Ferdinand Marcos died on September 28, 1989 of kidney, heart, and lung ailments. The Philippines, or the Republic of the Philippines, is a Southeast Asian country. It is an archipelago of 7,107 islands located in Western Pacific Ocean. Manila is its capital city. Geographically, the Philippines can be divided into three parts, namely Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. With all these islands combined, the country's coastline is the fifth longest in the world, spanning 36,289 kilometers. Arable farmland comprises more than 40% of the total land area. Although the Philippines is rich in agricultural potential, inadequate infrastructure, lack of financing, and government policies have limited productivity gains. Philippine farms produce food crops for domestic consumption and cash crops for export. The agricultural sector employs about one-third of the workforce but contributes less than a fifth of GDP. With its 7,107 islands, the Philippines owns a diverse range of fishing areas. Notwithstanding good prospects for marine fisheries, the industry continues to face a difficult future due to destructive fishing methods, a lack of funds, and inadequate government support. Small stores typify retail trade. Manila has major shopping centers and malls. Generally, sales are for cash or an open account. Retailing is conducted on a high markup, low turnover basis. The Philippines continued to export goods that it had been exporting before the Commonwealth period. This consisted primarily of semi-manufactured products and raw materials: coconut oil, pearl buttons, fiber hats, cigars, abaca, tobacco, sugar, and timber were the country's principal exports. The Philippines is one of the world's most highly mineralized countries, with untapped mineral wealth estimated at more than $840 billion. The Philippine copper, gold, and chromate deposits are among the largest in the world. Other important minerals include nickel, silver, coal, gypsum, and sulfur. The Philippines also has significant deposits of clay, limestone, marble, silica, and phosphate. Natural gas reserves discovered off Palawan have been brought online to generate electricity. The Philippines as an independent country has anchored her foreign policy on three paramounts, namely, close association with the United States, sympathy for the aspirations of all dependent countries, particularly Asia and the United States, and the United Nations. These three planks have been and continue to be implemented in various ways. The first plank of the Philippine foreign policy revolved around Filipino-American relations. The change from colonial status to independence necessitated readjustments in the relations between the Philippines and the United States. Consequently, they entered into treaties and agreements designed to continue the close friendship that has existed between them approximately since 1902. Such treaties are the Belt Trade Act and Tidings Rehabilitation Act of 1946, which are made to improve the damaged agriculture, industries, buildings, roads, bridges, and schoolhouses. In 1953, President Quirino and President Eisenhower communicated with each other on the importance of expanding and developing certain U.S. military bases in the Philippines, as well as outstanding property and related questions. Nothing resulted from these exchanges, owing to bloody incidents in which alleged Filipino piliferers were shot down like dogs inside the American bases. Filipinos have been fired upon and killed within the American base Clark Field. In 1968, a Filipino was shot to death by an American sentry in Cavite. The following year, another trigger-happy American soldier who was off-duty and in violation of U.S. military rules went hunting with his service pistol. In broad daylight, shot to death a Filipino employee of the military base. With the advent of the previously said events, a modification in the Philippine foreign policy was initiated. The increasing demand of the more far-sighted and nationalistic sector of the population for a re-examination of Philippine-American relations. On August 10, 1965, Foreign Secretary Mauro Mendez and American Ambassador William M. Blair, Jr. signed an agreement revising the Article 14 of the 1947 Bases Treaty. Realizing the need for unity in the ranks, the nationalists in all sectors banded themselves on February 8, 1967, into the Movement for the Advancement of Nationalism. The nationalists urged the people to stand on their own feet and to rely on themselves for salvation. And on July 27 to 28, 1969, President Nixon visited the Philippines, and in a farewell note, he said that,
As I come to the Philippines in this brief stay, I hope I can initiate a new era of Philippine-American relations, not returning to the old special relationship because the winds of change have swept away those factors, but building a new relationship which will be based on mutual trust, on mutual confidence, on mutual cooperation.
in the implementation of the second plank, the Philippines supported the cause of Indonesian independence and sponsored or actively participated in conferences concerning cultural, economic, and social questions that were and continue to be of paramount importance to the orientation In September 1954, 8 independent nations, including the Philippines, met in Manila to make collective arrangements a reality. On September 8, the representatives of the countries approved and signed the Manila Pact. At the same time, they also approved the Pacific Charter. In 1962, President Diosdado Macapagal took an active interest in bringing together the peoples of Malay stock. He proposed a summit conference among the leaders of the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaya. It was held in Manila from June 7 to 11, 1963, resulting in a 16-point agreement. This agreement is known as the Manila Accord, in which it laid down the principles that would give the countries known as Mapilindo. However, the Mapilindo didn't last long, since Western and Asian observers criticized it as racially inspired, which then led to a dispute between the Philippines and Malaysia, which was a tactical move on the part of Macapagal to force Malaysia to recognize the Philippines to claim Sabah. The dispute was resolved and diplomatic relations with Malaysia was re-established. The efforts of the Southeast Asian nations to rise up from the confines of their colonial past and to meet the challenge of the social, economic, and cultural conditions of the region led to the founding of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which was formally established in Bangkok, Thailand on August 8, 1967. Filipinos have a deep regard for education, which they view as a primary avenue for upward social and economic mobility. The almost half a century of the Americans in the Philippines was not ended with political independence in 1946. For one thing, education is predominantly American. The educational system is patterned after the American tradition of education, and English remained as the language of instruction, resulting in the perpetuation of colonial mentality. After the last war, there had been an increased college and university enrollment, but since the University of the Philippines could not accommodate all the students, this vacuum has been filled by private colleges and institutions. Almost 4 centuries of foreign domination have made many Filipinos polyglots. through the acquisition of Spanish and English, they have imbibed the Western cultural tradition. On the other hand, this resulted in the submergence of those Asian values, which are the basis of a national culture in evolution. In acquiring knowledge of other languages and culture, they also lost their capacity for understanding their own heritage. Thus, with the inauguration of the Commonwealth, Tagalog began to assume a national role and is taught in the schools. A few literary magazines appeared during the first years of liberation and became an effective instrument for the propagation of Tagalog. Some still exist today, such as Bulaklak and Liwayway. Many of the novels published in the popular weeklies derive their inspiration from American teleplays and comic strips. The essay, on the other hand, is not popular with the public, and so even the competent writers seldom write essays for lack of incentive and appreciation. However, some critical essays were collected in book form. It was entitled Ang Makata sa Panahon ng Makina. The continued support of the Cultural Center of the Philippines to the writers and artists had resulted to the production of readable verses and plays fit for stage. Playtic arts in the Philippines have been, for the most part, of European type and background. From Damian Domingo, the father of Filipino painting, to Fernando Amorsolo, Filipino painting has been largely influenced by European, especially Spanish brush. One significant change after the war was the growth of the middle class, thanks to the increased demand for professional services and corresponding increase of professionals. The pre-war upper class was composed largely of big landowners, while post-war upper class consists largely of industrialists and big businessmen. Increase in opportunities for employment has not yet overcome the rapid increase in population, resulting in the multiplication of the number of jobless proletariat. The upper class is earning more and more, and the lower class earning less and less. Thus, the distribution of wealth is one-sided. This resulted to the rise of new class, the squatters. The fall of old agrarian aristocracy has been caused partly by the development of commerce and industry. Aggressive and imaginative men from the lower and middle class have gone and are still going into commerce and industry with perseverance never before witnessed. Thus had been the new elites of the community. Alta Sociedad or high society is now mostly composed of traders, businessmen, and industrialists, and the daughters and wives who spend most of their times in the clubs. While the Borghese are acquiring wealth, they are at the same time trying to win political power through the use of padrinos or sponsors. "1970 began with rumors about Ferdinand Marcos's plans. He had just been elected to a second term as President of the Republic in 1969. There were allegations of electoral fraud. Heavy campaign spending caused the economy to falter and the peso devalued. Throughout the years, the nation grew frustrated with the government. Protest actions and riots rocked the capital. Under the Constitution, the president was limited to only 2 terms. Marcos would no longer be able to run for president in the next election in 1973.
In spite of any result of any constitutional convention, I have no intention of running for a third term. Don't you think that 2 terms is enough?
Rumors had it that he was already laying out plans to stay in power. Plan A. Change the Philippine government into a parliamentary system. If he couldn't run for president, he can always become prime minister. Plan B. Declare martial law.
I have proclaimed martial law in accordance with the powers vested in the President by the Constitution of the Philippines.
On September 21, 1972, Marcos declared martial law by virtue of Proclamation Number 1081, extending his rule beyond the constitutional 2-term limit. The declaration of martial law was to maintain the danger of rebellions and defeat the rising power of Jose Maria Sison's Communist Party that had paralyzed the functions of the national and local governments, increased unemployment, devalued the peso, and slowed down agriculture and industry. In September 1972, President Marcos proclaimed the entire Philippines as land reform area under the Presidential Decree No. 2. The Department of Agrarian Reform was established to expedite the transfer of land titles to the peasants. Under Presidential Decree No. 4, he established the National Grains Authority, which functions to minimize the effects of a crisis and regulate the distribution of grains. President Marcos also issued the Presidential Decree No. 6, prescribing rules and regulations regarding discipline in the government service. It spelled disciplinary actions against dishonesty, oppression, misconduct, and negligence in the performance of their duties. With this, the behavior of the government officials improved tremendously. With the implementation of a curfew, crime rates were lowered. Peace and order were maintained. However, distribution of wealth was unequal. The rich became richer, while the poor became poorer. A new constitution replacing the 1935 Constitution was ratified on January 17, 1973. This resulted in the official abolition of the legislative body, the exercise by President Marcos of the powers of the President and Prime Minister, changed from President to Parliamentary, and the exercise by the President of the power to call the Interim Assembly. President Marcos issued a decree extending tax amnesty to those who failed to pay the correct amount of tax. With this, tax collection rose massively. The tax collected was used in the construction of public and government facilities. Although many disapproved of the 1972 martial law, many changes were made that improved our country. The 1986 EDSA Revolution is praised worldwide for one of the most dramatic revolutions in history. The EDSA or People Power Revolution began in February 1986 as a result of the long oppressed freedom and life-threatening abuses executed by the Marcos government, such as the martial law proclamation in 1972.
I signed Proclamation number 1081, placing the entire Philippines under martial law.
The Filipinos reached the height of their patience when former Senator Benigno Aquino was assassinated in August 21, 1983. Marcos denied any involvement in the assassination, but was later proven guilty. In the next 3 years, protest rallies broke out nationwide. Corazon Aquino, widow of Ninoy Aquino, emerged as a symbolic leader of the people's anger towards the Marcos government. On February 7, 1986, Marcos held the presidential snap elections, where he was confronted by a strong opposition, Corazon Aquino. The elections were corrupt and deceitful, claiming Marcos as the winner. With the Filipinos in uproar, the EDSA Revolution took place in February 22, when Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Vice Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Fidel Ramos announced their withdrawal from Marcos. The Catholic Church, represented by Archbishop Cardinal Sin, summoned thousands of Filipinos to march the streets of the Epifanio de los Santos Avenue. The armed marine troops under President Marcos were blocked by thousands of men, women, and children. For 4 days, with the power of faith and prayers, the troops were forced to retreat. The EDSA Revolution is the first revolution in history where no bullets were fired and no blood was spilled.
Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus.
On February 25, 1986, Cory Aquino was sworn in as President of the Philippines. On the evening of the same day, the Marcos family left the Philippines for Hawaii. After nearly 20 years of dictatorship, Marcos was gone. Under a new government, President Aquino established the Freedom Constitution in 1986 to reorganize the government and appoint a commission to draft a new constitution. In February 1987, the drafted constitution was ratified, replacing the Freedom Constitution. The EDSA Revolution is a reminder that freedom is something we can never take for granted.
The triumph of a peaceful people power revolution and the ascension of Corazon Aquino into power signaled the end of authoritarian rule in the Philippines and the dawning of a new era for Filipinos. The relatively peaceful manner by which Aquino came into power drew international acclaim and admiration not only for her, but for the Filipino people as well. Despite the people power revolution, the democratic political system of the Philippines is still fragile and flawed. The 1987 Constitution's third article, titled "The Bill of Rights," is guaranteed by the state, but in most instances is largely ignored by the government and is viewed by foreign sources as coded to ensure tyranny of the majority. The revolution also provided the restoration of democratic institutions after 20 years of authoritarian rule. On September 18, 1986, just 7 months after she was swept to power by a popular revolt against dictator Ferdinand Marcos, President Corazon Aquino addressed the joint session of the United States Congress. During the first months of Aquino's presidency, the country experienced radical changes and sweeping democratic reforms. One of Aquino's first and boldest moves was the creation of the Presidential Commission on Good Government, or PCGG, which was tasked to go after the Marcos ill-gotten wealth. Aquino abolished the 1973 Marcos Constitution and dissolved the Marcos allies-dominated Batasang Pambansa. On the overall, the Aquino administration made important gains in the aspects of bringing back democracy, restoring investor confidence in the economy, and enacting legal and constitutional reforms.